The highway was quiet that February morning, except for one heartbeat that would never make it home. February 15, 1974, Minneapolis, Minnesota. A 25-year-old artist named Mary Schlais zipped up her coat, tucked her sketchbook into her bag, and stepped into the cold air. She was on her way to Chicago, hitchhiking, as many free-spirited souls did in the 1970s, to attend an art show that could launch her career. Mary wasn't reckless, just brave. She was bright, compassionate, a lover of animals and horses, known for her sketches of rural life. She just finished a series of watercolor portraits of local riders and planned to meet a Chicago gallery contact. To friends, she was sunshine, gentle and idealistic, living by heart. That morning, she left home with nothing but optimism and the promise to call once she arrived. She never would. Around midday, motorists along Interstate 94 noticed a young woman on the shoulder near Eau Claire, thumb raised, backpack over one shoulder. One driver later recalled she looked cheerful, not desperate. Another said she had been picked up by a man driving a brown or tan vehicle, possibly a station wagon. That man was never identified. Hours later, near the sleepy crossroads of 990th Street and 408th Avenue in Dunn County, the wind carved drifts through the snowbanks. A farmer driving past noticed something out of place in the ditch. A splash of color in the white landscape. He pulled over. What he saw made him stagger back. Under a thin sheet of snow was a woman's body, face turned to the side, dark hair matted, coat slashed open. When deputies arrived, they noted multiple stab wounds, 17 in all. Deep, frenzied. Her hands were cut and bruised. She had fought. Her identification was quick. Mary still carried her purse. But why she had been killed, and by whom, was a mystery. The scene was eerily empty. No weapon, no footprints except tire tracks leading back to the highway. No blood trail beyond the immediate site. It was as though the killer had vanished into the winter air. And yet, one clue remained. A stocking cap, orange and black, was found a few feet from Mary's body. Officers bagged it, unsure if it belonged to her or her killer. They didn't know it then, but that small piece of wool would one day tell the story Mary could not. Detectives canvassed the area. They interviewed passing motorists, truckers, nearby residents. Witnesses had seen a man in his 30s with short brown hair, driving a light-colored car, but the trail went cold fast. This was 1974. No surveillance cameras, no cell phone pings, no DNA databases. Within weeks, the case file grew thick with typed statements and blurry black and white photographs. Within months, it began to gather dust. Mary's parents never recovered from her loss. Her brother Don told reporters years later, "Every day I looked for her name somewhere. News, radio, anywhere. But she was gone, and so was her case." By the late 1980s, the case was practically dormant. Detectives retired, evidence boxes moved into storage. The hat, though preserved, seemed meaningless. Forensic testing existed only in theory. But somewhere in that orange and black weave, two tiny hairs clung to life, unnoticed, unremarkable, but quietly waiting through 5 decades of silence. And soon, they would start to whisper. The snow preserves everything, even secrets. The night after Mary Schlais's body was found, Dunn County deputies sealed off the rural road. Floodlights hissed in the cold, melting thin halos into the snow. Detectives, shivering under heavy coats, scoured the ditches, marking tire impressions and footprints that faded as the wind picked up. There wasn't much to find. No murder weapon, no blood trail. Only one thing stood out. A stocking cap, orange and black, flecked with frozen grass. The hat looked ordinary, but the crime scene tech noted something strange. Mary wasn't wearing a hat when she left Minneapolis. So whose was it? It was bagged, labeled, and logged into evidence. The lab dusted for prints, none. Fiber comparison, nothing useful. They placed it inside an airtight envelope, sealed with tape, and filed it away, unaware that it held the only surviving trace of the man who had killed her. In the following weeks, investigators interviewed dozens of motorists who'd been on the interstate that day. Several recalled seeing a young woman matching Mary's description. Some mentioned a tan or brown vehicle stopping near her. One trucker claimed he saw her talking to a man in a light-colored car. But every description was slightly different, every memory blurred by distance, time, and trauma. One suspect's name came up repeatedly, a man from Minnesota with a history of violence, who'd been seen traveling through the area that winter. He was questioned, then cleared. His alibi checked out. Detectives built a timeline. Morning. Mary leaves Minneapolis, seen hitchhiking near Eau Claire. Afternoon. Witnesses see her enter a vehicle heading east. Evening. Her body is found just off the county road, about 2 hours from where she was last seen alive. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitness to the murder, and no solid leads. In the 1970s, before DNA, a case like this could only go so far. And by spring, the case had already started to cool. The following decade stretched like a slow ache. Mary's family clung to hope that someone, somewhere, would confess, or that some new piece of evidence would surface. But nothing did. Investigators came and went. Files changed hands. Evidence boxes shifted from one shelf to another. The orange and black hat was moved 3 times from a metal cabinet to a storage locker to a temperature-controlled archive. Each time someone wrote preserve potential DNA. But the technology that could read those silent traces didn't exist yet. In 1989, a new detective reviewed the Schlais case file. He found the hat still sealed, the paper tag faded but intact. He ordered it re-examined using then-modern fiber analysis. The result? Inconclusive. No unique match. No suspect. The case went back into storage. By the time the 1990s arrived, Mary's story had faded from public memory. But for her brother Don, the pain hadn't dulled. Each February, he'd drive the stretch of road where she was found, placing wildflowers by the fence post. He once told a local paper, "They took her future and left us only questions." Meanwhile, inside the Dunn County Sheriff's Office, a small group of investigators refused to let go. Cold case detective Rodney Dickus revisited the Schlais file every few years. He'd read the same yellowed notes, stare at the same black and white photos of the snowbank, and whisper to himself, "One day, this will break." Still, the case seemed unbreakable. Until almost 50 years later, science finally caught up. In 2022, the Sheriff's Office partnered with the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center at Ramapo College in New Jersey. They had been quietly helping agencies across the country solve decades-old murders using trace DNA from forgotten evidence. The Schlais case, untouched for half a century, landed on their desk. Technicians carefully unsealed the old evidence envelope. The cap was still there, fragile but preserved. Inside, they found 2 tiny strands of hair, less than an inch long. One was identified as Mary's. The other was not. They extracted DNA, amplifying it molecule by molecule until it could be read. When uploaded to genealogical databases, the sample produced distant familial matches, second cousins, distant relatives. Slowly over months, a family tree began to form. But the branches didn't quite line up. Some names didn't exist in public records. One missing link kept appearing: a man adopted in childhood whose original birth records had been sealed. Detectives now believed the killer's identity had been hidden by adoption, complicating the genetic trail. But the data pointed unmistakably toward one bloodline, one family living in Minnesota. The investigators didn't have a name yet, just a feeling. As they dug deeper, a pattern emerged. One man who fit the genetic markers, age, and geography, a retired factory worker named John Keith Miller, living quietly in Owatonna, Minnesota. He was 84 years old. When the lead investigator first said his name aloud in 2023, the room went silent. Could this frail old man really be the same person who'd stabbed a hitchhiker nearly 50 years earlier? Detectives decided to find out. They began surveillance, collected discarded DNA samples from Miller's trash, and waited for the results. When the lab results came back, they confirmed it. The DNA from the orange and black stocking cap the hat found beside Mary's lifeless body matched John Keith Miller. After half a century, The ghost in the snow finally had a name. But the story doesn't end there, because when detectives knocked on Miller's door, what he told them would chill even the most hardened investigators. Sometimes the truth doesn't decay. It just sleeps, waiting for someone brave enough to wake it. On a quiet street in Owatonna, Minnesota, a white house sat tucked behind a maple tree, its porch sagging from age. It was October 2024, nearly 50 years since Mary Schlais had been murdered. Two Dunn County investigators, Detective Rodney Dykus and Special Agent Corey Kay, walked up that porch, hearts pounding. They'd waited months for this moment. The DNA had spoken, the genealogy was complete, and the orange and black hat had done what no witness ever could. It pointed straight to John Keith Miller, 84 years old, retired machinist, father, and grandfather. The detectives knocked. The door creaked open. An old man peered out, confused but calm. "John Miller?" one detective asked. "Yeah," he said slowly. "What's this about?" They asked if they could come inside. He hesitated, then nodded. The living room smelled faintly of dust and wood polish. Framed family photos lined the wall, a man once strong and confident, now faded by time. For a moment, the air was still. Then Detective Dykus spoke the name that had haunted his career. "We're here about Mary Schlais." The silence that followed was heavy. Miller blinked, his expression unreadable. "I don't know who that is," he murmured. But the tremor in his hands told another story. They showed him a photograph, the orange and black stocking cap, preserved all these years. "Recognize this?" Miller's eyes lingered on it too long. Detectives could almost see the memories flicker behind his pupils. Flashes of snow, headlights, blood. Then came the DNA results. They told him his genetic material matched the hairs found on that hat at the crime scene. Not just a possibility, a certainty. Miller swallowed hard, his jaw clenched. "I don't know how that could be," he said weakly. "I never hurt anyone." Detectives didn't push not yet. They let the weight of silence press down. The old man's eyes welled with something between fear and surrender. Finally, his shoulders sagged. He whispered, "I remember picking up a girl once, a long time ago." He spoke haltingly at first, words cracking through decades of repression. He said it was February 1974, a bitterly cold day. He'd been driving east toward Eau Claire when he saw a woman hitchhiking by the highway. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, carrying a sketchbook in a bag. "She seemed nice," he said quietly. "Just needed a ride." At first, the drive was calm. She talked about art, about Chicago, about her dreams. Then Miller said, "I asked if she wanted to fool around. When Mary refused, things escalated fast. She got scared," he admitted, "told me to stop the car. He didn't. She tried to open the door while I was still driving. I panicked. I reached up. There was a knife above the visor and..." His voice trailed off. He looked at the floor. "I stabbed her. I don't even remember how many times." Investigators sat in silence, recording every word. He told them he dragged her body off the road into the snowbank, tried to cover her with snow, thinking no one would see. Then headlights appeared down the road, another car. He ran back to his vehicle and sped off, leaving the hat behind. He said he drove home, washed the blood from his hands, and never spoke again. For 50 years, Miller lived an ordinary life. He married, raised a family, worked as a machinist in Minnesota. No criminal record, no violence. Nothing that suggested the man next door carried the weight of murder. But when investigators traced his past, they found a shadowed history: adoptive parents, sealed birth records, and early behavioral issues. A pattern of manipulation, short temper, and quiet control. Nothing overtly criminal, but something unsettling beneath the surface. When detectives asked why he did it, his answer chilled them. "She just made me angry," he said flatly. "I don't know why." After decades of searching, this was the monster they had been chasing. Not a drifter, not a serial predator, but a man who simply never learned empathy. On November 7, 2024, after confirming the confession and matching DNA, Dunn County deputies arrested John Keith Miller for the 1974 murder of Mary Schlais. The press release read simply, "After 50 years, justice has found its way home." Miller was charged with first-degree intentional homicide and booked into the Dunn County Jail. When reporters asked about the case, Sheriff Kevin Bigg called it a victory for persistence, science, and a family that never gave up. Mary's brother Don was notified that same day. He wept when he heard the news. "She's finally at peace," he said softly. "All these years, she's been waiting for someone to hear her." In the weeks that followed, the story spread across the nation. People were stunned that an 84-year-old man could be arrested for a crime so old, solved not by eyewitnesses or fingerprints, but by a few microscopic strands of hair preserved in silence for half a century. Journalists revisited the case files, posting side-by-side photos. Mary at 25, smiling beside her easel, and Miller, gray-haired and frail, led away in handcuffs. Time had flipped the roles. The young woman who had dreamed of painting the world was gone. The man who ended her life had spent 5 decades pretending to be normal. But science never forgot. And justice, though slow, never died. They say the past is gone, but in the Mary Schlais case, the past was just waiting frozen beneath the snow, whispering through 2 tiny strands of hair, until someone finally listened. Time doesn't erase guilt. It only measures how long justice is willing to wait. It was March 2025, Dunn County Circuit Court, Menominee, Wisconsin. The room was filled with quiet tension reporters scribbling notes, cameras positioned discreetly at the back, and a small cluster of faces who had waited 50 years for this day. When John Keith Miller shuffled into the courtroom, wearing a plain gray sweater and shackles around his ankles, no one spoke. He looked frail, hollowed by age, but the weight of what he carried was enormous. Across the aisle sat Mary Schlais's family, her brother Don, her niece Nina, and cousins who had grown up only knowing her through faded photographs and the stories their parents told. They had aged too, their faces lined not just by time but by grief that had never been resolved. Judge Rod Smeltzer opened the hearing with solemn words. "This court has waited half a century to speak for a woman who could not. Today, we do." Miller's attorney stood, requesting that the court accept a plea of no contest to first-degree intentional homicide. It wasn't a plea of innocence, only an admission that the state's evidence was overwhelming. The judge asked him to confirm, "Mr. Miller, do you understand the charges against you and the potential sentence?" He nodded weakly. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was hoarse, barely audible. Then as the prosecutor recited the facts, the DNA match, the confession, the knife, the stocking cap, the decades of deception, Miller stared straight ahead, unmoving. Not once did he look at Mary's family. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he paused for several seconds. The courtroom waited. Then he spoke 3 words that felt like a hollow echo of remorse. "I'm sorry, truly." Don Schlais clenched his fists. His jaw tightened. Later, he would tell a reporter, "It wasn't apology, it was convenience." The judge's voice cut through the silence. "John Keith Miller, for the murder of Mary Kathleen Schlais, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison." There was no applause, no outburst, only the faint sound of someone exhaling through tears. The gavel struck once. After 50 years, the word guilty finally hung in the air. As deputies led Miller away, his eyes flickered toward the gallery, not in defiance, but in resignation. He was 84. It was unlikely he would ever breathe free air again. But for Mary's family, justice wasn't about revenge. It was about acknowledgement, the world finally saying her name with truth attached to it. Outside the courthouse, Don spoke softly to a group of journalists. She was an artist. She painted light. And this man lived in darkness. But now that light wins. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office released a statement that afternoon. For 50 years, this case symbolized endurance. The arrest of John Miller reminds us that no matter how much time passes, no file is ever forgotten. The lead detective, Rodney Dykus, later said in an interview, "When we solved Mary's case, it wasn't science that made me emotional. It was seeing her brother finally smile." For the forensic genealogists who'd worked the case, it was validation. The tiny fragments of hair that had survived half a century became the silent testimony that spoke louder than any witness ever could. That summer, Mary's family gathered at the same quiet crossroads in Springbrook Township where her body had been found 50 years earlier. They placed a wooden cross at the edge of the field, painted white, with her name carved in careful script. Mary Kathleen Schlais, 1949, 1974. Gone too soon, never forgotten. As the wind rustled through the trees, Dawn whispered to the air, "You can rest now, Mary. The road finally ends here." The Schlais case will be remembered not only for its brutality, but for what it represents: the collision of two eras, one of paper reports and hunches, and one of digital forensics and DNA precision. For half a century, the evidence sat silent, yet it waited, preserved by cold and hope. And when justice came, it came not with vengeance, but with truth. Because sometimes justice doesn't rush. It arrives when the world is ready to hear it. Snow begins to fall again, just as it did that night in 1974. Only this time it feels different, peaceful. 50 winters came and went before the snow gave back its secret. 50 years of silence, broken by two fragile strands of hair and a whisper of truth. But for every secret unearthed, another still sleeps beneath the frost. Some rivers still run cold, and one of them is about to speak. If Mary's story moved you, if it reminded you that truth can outlive even time itself, don't let her voice fade again. Subscribe to Criminal Minds Archives and join us as we uncover the next case where the dead demand to be heard. Turn on notifications, because some stories refuse to stay buried.